I guess the belief that every sentence should start with a definite article would be, theism. So, the conversation about the existence of God has been an ongoing discussion for a few thousand years. We have dialogues recorded by the ancient Romans and Greeks of discussions and disagreements over the nature of the gods, and many of these ancient dialogues are still discussed today. A famous example of these is the dialogue between Euthyphro and Socrates discussing goodness, or more specifically piety, and its relationship with the gods. The result is that we have a myriad of arguments that are used to establish that a belief in God or the gods is rational, many of which have roots thousands of years old. There are obviously disagreements and discussions about how well these arguments work, whether or not they're convincing, or even whether or not they're reasonable in the first place. Even the aforementioned Greek and Roman philosophers disagreed strongly with each other about the particulars of their arguments. But the fact remains that there are several that have been preserved, discussed at length, and have stood the test of time and remain argued today in various forms by modern philosophers. Some of these are more specialized arguments, trying to connect the God of classical theism to Christianity, Islam, or some other religion. But there are many that are just arguing for the conception of God in the first place. But it should be noted that these arguments will often work just as well for polytheism. And sometimes, polytheism fits the bill even better than monotheism. Now, this does make sense, in part due to the fact that many of the people that originated the most basic forms of these arguments were, in fact, polytheists. For whatever reason, the concept that thinkers such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were polytheists is somehow seen as controversial to some, but they were. Aristotle, for example, placed in his last will and testament that a statue in the likeness of his mother be devoted to Demeter, and that statues to Zeus and Athena be erected to ensure the safe return of his intended son-in-law. But, that being said, let's take a look at some of these arguments. There's a bunch of them, and I can only cover so many, so I'd like to go through some of the more common ones that we all run into. The arguments that I'd like to go through here are the ontological, the cosmological, the teleological, and the experiential arguments. The first one that we'll take a look at is the ontological argument, which I think is one of the arguments that works more readily for monotheism, which is why I'll open with it. But it's also probably considered the most inconsequential. The argument largely hinges on the conception of greatness, and that God is the greatest imaginable being. It proposes that one can imagine the greatest possible being, and that a being that necessarily exists is greater than one that does not necessarily exist. Therefore, just as a matter of consistency with this conception, God exists, and exists necessarily. Take that, atheists. Fun story, actually. In college, I signed up for a philosophy of religion class, and in the first week, we discussed the ontological argument. And once I had finally read it and understood it, I decided this philosophy crap just wasn't for me, and I promptly withdrew from the class. I was like, is this a thing? This can't be a thing. If you can do this with God, then you would be able to do it with anything else that's great. Like, what about the greatest island or whatever? And it turns out that's literally a objection to this argument that philosophers spend their time on. But yeah, a lot of people might agree that the ontological argument is a situation in which it's a stupid argument that just doesn't intuitively mean anything. But the fun part about it is if one agrees that the premises are true, and many of them are reasonably agreeable, then the conclusion follows from the premises, which gives it a certain amount of power. But as stated, it hinges on the concept of greatness. One way to look at this argument might be to realize that greatness is a subjective concept. Something can attain greatness in ways that are contradictory to other conceptions of greatness. Think of the greatest warrior versus the greatest pacifist. Even existence being great may vary depending on the conception of greatness. As a result, the recognition of multiple conceptions of greatness, in my opinion, throws a wrench into this argument, and in fact may make the ontological argument an argument that, upon further examination, works better for polytheism. For example, if you consider the ontological argument with respect to greatness and look at it from a phallic perspective, the God of the Bible does not have significant evidence in his favor. Frere, on the other hand. So, unless God's greatness includes this phallic interpretation, as well as greatness from other contradictory perspectives, then the ontological argument fails for me. However, one could look at this and say, hey, the multiplicity of the forms of greatness must imply multiple gods, although the implications of ontological phallic greatness might contain a bit of a struggle, perhaps, between Frere and, say, Priapus. But I'm just dicking around at this point. Definitely something to toy with. Don't look too far into that. But honestly, I think that this perspective on the ontological argument is about as convincing as its original iteration, in that it largely isn't. The ontological argument rings to me as more of a word trick than something that actually convinces people of theism. Next, let's discuss the cosmological argument. This one is very old, dating back at least to ancient Greece, with Aristotle and Plato, polytheists, who posited the notion of a prime mover. The argument has seen various forms, most notably the Kalam cosmological argument, which is used in a variety of forms by Christians today, despite its origination from Muslim thinker Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali was convinced that the universe had begun to exist, and that the way to avoid the infinite regress of causes going back into infinity was to change the form of the cosmological argument. The argument goes, famously, whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence. Now, the discourse around this argument is vast, but the implication is that there is a cause that did not begin to exist, from which we can credit with, at least through some process, directly or indirectly, the beginning of the universe. Within philosophy, that which did not begin to exist with some capability to cause the universe is potentially God. Now, what does this do to polytheism? Nothing really. There's nothing stopping a polytheist from using this argument to support polytheism. In fact, it probably supports polytheism even better. Polytheism would be compatible with the cause of the universe being one God or many. So it's therefore more likely to support polytheism anyway. The cause of the universe originating from many gods is obviously consistent with polytheism. And the cause of the universe originating with one God would also be consistent with polytheism. Monotheism, on the other hand, is consistent with the universe originating from one deity, but is not consistent with originating from many, making polytheism the more likely candidate if the universe has divine origin. Let's talk about this likelihood thing in a way that's a little fun. If the truth of the matter is that one God created the universe, then monotheism may be true and polytheism may be true. If the truth of the matter is that two gods created the universe, then monotheism is false and polytheism is true. If the truth of the matter is that three gods created the universe, then monotheism is false and polytheism is true, and so on into infinity. So if we assume for a moment that all we know is that the universe has divine origin and no other information, then it is infinitely more likely that polytheism is true than monotheism. To expand on this, there is no requirement within polytheism for every deity to be the creator. In fact, as far as I'm aware, there is no such tradition that involves every single deity being involved in creation. Though there are plenty of polytheist traditions in which the universe is brought about through the involvement of more than one deity, and still others with a single deity as a creator among many gods. Now, do these deities have an originating cause? In some cases, yes, but that doesn't prevent them from being creator deities themselves. And the spirit of the Kalam only requires that there be at least one uncaused cause somewhere. Multiple uncaused causes would still work for the argument. And these causes could be anything, even something without agency. It may be just some uncaused primordial from which the gods may come. The Greeks called it chaos, and the Norse called it Gunungagap. Now let's talk about the teleological argument, also known as the argument from design. This is commonly expressed in the form of an analogy with a watchmaker. Basically, if you're just walking on the beach and you see a pocket watch just chilling there, keeping time, doing its thing, do you assume that it formed randomly, just like arose out of the sand on the beach? Or do you suppose that it was just always there? Or do you suppose that someone at some point made the pocket watch? Now, obviously, most of us would say that someone made it, thereby legitimizing the conception of a watchmaker. And the analogy expands, noting that the reasons why we say this about the pocket watch can easily be scaled up to the complexity of the universe, implying that it too was designed by some universe maker. There are supporting arguments for this, such as the fine-tuning argument, noting that the complexities of the universe seem finely tuned for life as we know it. If gravity didn't work, or if forces that bond molecules functioned a little differently, life, at least as we understand it, wouldn't be possible. Sometimes the analogy will get scaled up to a building, that when we come across a building, it's clear that this didn't occur by chance. This was intentionally built and designed. And here's where the analogy starts to run into some trouble if you look at it from the perspective of a monotheist. The polytheist might agree that the building is built and designed with intention, but how many buildings do you see that are built by a single person? In the cases of most buildings, you would have like an architect, a foreman, carpenters, plumbers, electricians. Scaling up the example suddenly provides a more reasonable argument for design and creation by a team. Not a single watchmaker, but a set of watchmakers working together. Now, imagine in your head a building constructed by a single person. Now imagine in your head a building constructed by a team. What is the major difference that pops into your head? The team enables scale, scaling up the project's size and therefore the need for a multiplicity of dedicated details raises the likelihood of a team effort, at least in the case of buildings. And the universe seems to be a scaled-up project with a multiplicity of fine details to get exactly right. And it seems plausible that if the universe requires design and tuning, that there was a team rather than an individual. Are humans as individuals capable of every job on a construction site or a design team? Sure. But does that mean that one human is capable of performing all the duties necessary on a construction site or a design team to see through the construction of a complex building? Anyone who's worked in construction will tell you that many tasks just require more than one person. And it's not unreasonable that the same could be true with the task of making a universe, which is what we see in many polytheist traditions. Notably, in Norse tradition, Odin, Vili, and Ve work together to assemble Midgard, which is further maintained by numerous agents. But, on a construction site, everyone's favorite person is that one guy who knows everything about plumbing, electricity, architecture, carpentry, etc. Absolutely everyone's favorite person with invaluable contributions. And I can imagine a deity fancying himself as this kind of deity among all the other gods, working hard, ensuring a smooth creation. Definitely everyone's favorite god, probably the only one that can really be called a god. Could probably do everything on his own, and even if he didn't, he might still tell everyone who'll listen that he did. Now, would an omnipotent deity be capable of just doing all of this? Definitionally, it does seem possible, but that doesn't mean that's what happened. Capability does not translate to achievement. All we'd have to ask is if this god performs all of the actions that he needs to have performed on his own, or if some other entities are observed as performing them. And at least in Christian tradition, the answer seems to be yes. Was God capable of delivering a message to Mary that she was preggers? Sure, he's seen as omnipotent. But he didn't do it. An angel did. The teleological argument, or argument from design, is widely considered one of the more convincing theistic arguments. And I think it's one that works far better for polytheism than monotheism. I even think that Occam's razor, a common objection to polytheism, would actually side with polytheism on this matter. There is also, finally, the argument from personal experience. Now, many will hold that a personal experience is reason enough to stick to a religion, and that because they had personal experience with their deity, this gives them evidence that this deity exists. Now, while it's true that spiritual experiences attested to deities work as evidence for theistic claims, a personal spiritual experience does not mean that all other aspects of the religion are true. And this is one reason why the argument from personal experience doesn't bear out for monotheism. In fact, the argument from personal experience is inherently polytheist. Now, I'm genuinely unaware what about personal experience actually gets someone to monotheism. One can even have experience with the Christian God, as people often do, and it doesn't mean that monotheism is true. There's nothing about an experience with one deity that implies no others exist. It just means that there's experiential evidence for the Christian God, as there are for many other gods. If we are to weight spiritual experiences as evidence, The natural conclusion would be that there are many gods associated with a variety of traditions. Now, to do otherwise would be to simply favor one experience over the other, expressing a bias in the analysis. And this often manifests as relabeling, or just pretending the evidence is something other than it is. And from monotheists, this will often come in two forms. One is dismissing them as demons or something similar to that, which amounts to name-calling and nothing more. Another is viewing other deities as aspects of a single deity, which is also name-calling, if only in a different style, which may work within a tradition's interpretation, but not for an unbiased analysis of these experiences. Both of these approaches label the experience as something other than what is expressed. Now, obviously, there are traditions that hold to demons, and there are traditions that hold to deities who represent themselves in a variety of forms. And there are interpretations of personal experiences that offer these accounts, but to take these interpretations and apply them to experiences that do not include these interpretations would just be inserting bias, rather than looking at the attestations as described. And when we simply look at experiences in this way, the most straightforwardly apparent result is polytheism. A god of many forms can exist alongside other deities. Heck, consider Odin and Loki, considered shapeshifters and gods of many forms, and yet they exist in the same pantheon with each other. Demons and similar such entities as well will show up in many traditions with multiple gods. So these experiences do not combat polytheism, but are in fact consistent with it. Before resorting to relabeling, one would need to provide a good reason for saying that these experiences are other than what they seem to be, without saying this of all experiences, including the experiences preferred by the one putting forward the relabeling. But before one even gets into this reasoning, they must first undermine a straightforward, polytheist explanation for the variety of spiritual experiences. And as we can see, these arguments widely used to support monotheism work just fine for polytheism as well. Now, are there arguments that work for monotheism alone and not for polytheism? Kinda. There are some arguments that try and build a necessity for a triomny deity, but many of these arguments do not exclude polytheism. They just support the idea of a particular deity existing. They don't prevent the existence of gods, as polytheists generally understand them, from existing in addition to this entity. A monotheist argument defining the conception of God as proprietary to their religious view does not mean that the gods of other traditions are not gods in their own right. And never mind the fact that most of these arguments are usually based on Plato, who was a polytheist. Now, do these arguments also work for monotheism? With the exception of the argument from experience, I'd say yes. You can have a monotheist interpretation of the teleological argument, the ontological argument, and the cosmological argument. Obviously so, because that's the form they commonly take. You can try for the experiential argument for monotheism, but I think that requires a lot of heavy lifting and maybe accusing everyone else of lying. But the point is that often these arguments work just as well, and sometimes even better, for polytheism. Even in the case where you might argue that they work better for monotheism, they, most importantly, don't prevent polytheism from being the state of affairs, even with a single creator, designer, and/or manifestation of greatness. But what do y'all think? And which one do you think works best for polytheism? And which one might work best for monotheism? I find that a lot of polytheists are very experience-centric in their approach to theology. We seem to want to explore what we've interacted with, or what is widely attested to, and to give honor to those who give us these various gifts in our lives. But that doesn't mean that we have to ignore these other arguments if we want to dig a little bit deeper, as many of them work just as well, if not better, for our own traditions. But with that, hail to my patrons for making this content possible. It's good to have people at your back. There are many like buttons on this channel, but one might argue that you only see aspects of a single subscribe button in your many experiences of it. We'll have to debate this theology in the comments. Ring the bell if you want to be kept posted for more heathen content, and remember to find a way or make one. You thought there was going to be a secret clip, but there's not. Oh, damn it.